Was it awesome to have Gabe back here? Or what? Is that cool? I love it. If you're visiting with us or you're so new that you don't know who this guy was that was up here ad-libbing, that's Gabe Much. He started coming to our church as a freshman in high school. He was about that big. And he's been a huge part of our church family and led worship here for a long time. Is now going to another church down in the Seattle area. But we love you, Gabe, and it's good to have you back here, up here mixing it up with announcements. Awesome. And also, if you're visiting and you happen to hear me call the announcements lady Babe, it's because I'm married to her. So don't get creeped out by that. I don't do that with all the ladies. This morning we're starting a brand new series, and it's called Impact. And the point of this series is you and me learning to live our lives in such a way that we're used by God to leave an impact on this world. And today I want us to talk about the dangers of what we could call the shadow mission. Okay, now here's the idea. We are all created by God for a mission. But if we don't learn to embrace our God-given mission, we can allow our lives to deteriorate into centering around something that's kind of selfish, something that's kind of trivial, maybe even something that's kind of dark. Okay, our shadow mission. And we're going to start this series, we're going to kick this sucker off today by walking through the story in the book of Esther. And it's a story out of the Old Testament with characters given a choice, several of them, between a mission from God, and their shadow mission. Will they embrace what God has called them to do, or will they deteriorate into pursuing something else? And I want to say right up front that I am indebted to John Ortberg for the idea of shadow mission as well as his rich insights into the book of Esther. Okay, now let me set this up a little bit before we roll into this. The book of Esther is set in the capital of Persia named Susa. And this is several hundred years before Jesus. It's a story about the Jews, and they've been taken out of their land, they've been taken out of Israel, and they're living as exiles in this foreign land, okay, in Persia. And this story spans 10 chapters, and so I'm going to have to, for your sake, you don't want to be here till 7 o'clock at night, so I'm going to have to summarize huge chunks of it. But to get us going, let me just read the first 9 verses, because this really paints a picture of what's going on in the kingdom. This is great. Okay, Esther chapter 1, starting with verse 1. This is what happened during the time of Xerxes, the Xerxes who ruled over 127 provinces stretching from India to Cush. At that time, King Xerxes reigned from his royal throne in the citadel of Susa, and in the 3rd year of his reign, he gave a banquet for all his nobles and officials. The military leaders of Persia and Media, the princes and the nobles of the provinces were present. For a full 180 days, he displayed the vast wealth of his kingdom and the splendor and glory of his majesty. When these days were over, the king gave a banquet lasting 7 days in the enclosed garden of the king's palace for all the people from the least to the greatest who were in the citadel of Susa. The garden had hangings of white and blue linen, fastened with cords of white linen and purple material to silver rings on marble pillars. There were couches of gold and silver on a mosaic pavement of porphyry, marble, mother of pearl, and other costly stones. Wine was served in goblets of gold, each one different from the other, and the royal wine was abundant in keeping with the king's liberality. By the king's command, each guest was allowed to drink with no restrictions, for the king instructed all the wine stewards to serve each man what he wished. Queen Vashti also gave a banquet for the women in the royal palace of King Xerxes. So the author wants us to understand that King Xerxes is unbelievably powerful. I mean, his kingdom is massive. We're told right up front there are 127 provinces in his kingdom. He was by far the wealthiest, most powerful man in the world, and he's a guy that loves to party. In the first 9 verses of this story, we see 3 huge parties. The first one involves all of his nobles and officials, and it lasts, does anybody remember how long? 180 days. Hello. You think about that. 180 days of endless partying. It's like a couple of semesters at Wazoo. And when that party's over, what does he do? He throws another huge bash. This time it's a 7-day rager, and the whole capital city is involved. Okay, like all of Susa. I mean, Xerxes wants everybody to be in awe of his immense wealth. And this party gets described in detail. The writer goes to great lengths to spell out just how extravagant it was. It says there are couches of gold and silver on mosaic pavement. There's pillars of marble, these exquisite tapestries. And everyone is not just drinking wine, they're drinking wine from golden goblets, and each goblet is unique. They've all been like handcrafted. And the drinking was unrestrained. I mean, the king has turned the capital into Animal House. And while all this is going on, the Queen Vashti, is throwing a nice little quiet party for her lady friends. And it says in verse 10 that on the 7th day of all of this, when the king was in high spirits from the wine, he sends for Queen Vashti. So, like, he's been showing off his possessions all week long, and now he wants to show off his ultimate possession. And so what do you guess he wants to show everybody about Queen Vashti? You think he wants to show everybody her brilliant intellect? Like, is he bringing her in to solve the Rubik's Cube? Like, to do some really difficult math problems? No, it says, in verse 11, it says, he called her in order to display her beauty to the people and nobles, for she was lovely to look at. A shocking thing happens. Vashti says, no. Come and parade myself before a bunch of good old boys after 7 days of Miller time? I don't think so. Just stay home and wash my hair, thank you. Now the king is in kind of a predicament. How's he going to handle this? What's he going to do? What's he going to say? Is he going to say, you know, sweetheart, you're right, that would have been really awkward. That was like insensitive of me, and it was rude, and it was chauvinistic. I'm so sorry I ever suggested it. Please forgive me. No. It says in verse 12, the king became furious and burned with anger. Why? Because this struck right at the heart of his sense of power and dominance and control. And it made him look weak in front of everybody. It ate away at his image. It ate away at his shadow mission. So, verse 13. Since it was customary for the king to consult experts in matters of the law and justice, he spoke with the wise men who understood the times. The writer wants us to see some irony here. The most powerful guy in the world can't control his wife, so he goes to the Supreme Court. He makes it a matter of state. He's like, guys, what am I going to do with my wife? She won't listen. And check out the response of his advisors, these brilliant men of wisdom. It says, then Memucan, who's like the spokesman for the Supreme Court, then Memucan replied in the presence of the king and the nobles, Queen Vashti has done wrong, not only against the king, but also against all the nobles and all the peoples of the provinces of King Xerxes. Wow. For the queen's conduct will become known to all the women, and so they will despise their husbands and say, King Xerxes commanded Queen Vashti to be brought before him, but she would not come. This very day, the Persian and Median women of the nobility who have heard about the queen's conduct will respond to all the king's nobles in the same way. There will be no end of disrespect and discord. King, if you don't get a handle on this, we're all in trouble. The wives are going to rise up all over the kingdom. It's going to be pandemonium across the land. So, verses 19 to 20. Therefore, if it pleases the king, Let him issue a royal decree, and it will be written in the laws of Persia and Media, which cannot be repealed, that Vashti is never again to enter the presence of King Xerxes. She can be heartbroken about that. Also, let the king give her royal position to someone else who is better than she. Then when the king's edict, this is awesome. Listen to these guys. Then when the king's edict is proclaimed throughout all the vast realm, all the women will respect their husbands from the least to the greatest. Yeah, that'll happen. And part of what's happening here in the story, the writer is showing us what like massive brown nosers these guys are. I mean, they say to him, let this be edict proclaimed throughout your vast realm. Your kingdom is huge, O king. Like you demand, Xerxes. And we see that the king has surrounded himself with people that will reinforce his shadow mission. And so the king thinks, hey, you know what? That's a good idea, guys. That's what I'm going to do. And he deposes Vashti. In chapter 2, when the king sobers up and his anger subsides, he realizes he doesn't have a queen. And so he thinks, man, I got to get a new queen. And he's advised by his personal attendants on how to go about this. Now, these guys are not the Supreme Court advisors. Okay? These are like young guys that kind of work with him all the time on a daily basis. These are high testosterone young men who give him the idea of what to look for in a new queen. Anybody want to guess what their number one criteria is going to be for the new queen? Looks. They're like, you need to get yourself a hot-looking queen. So they suggest that he hold a Miss Medes and Persians beauty contest where every province would contribute to the royal harem the best-looking woman in the province. Anybody remember how many provinces there were? 127. And in the end, they say that the one who pleases the king, the girl who turns his head and makes him go, wow, the most, she will then become the ultimate trophy wife. Now, I know for you go, how can that be? I mean, it's just hard for us to believe in our day that there was once a culture so superficial that middle-aged men would try to impress people by showing that they have so much wealth and power that they could attract a young and beautiful wife. I mean, we just can't even imagine that. But there was once such a culture. So that's what the king does. And one of the contestants is a young Jewish girl named Esther. She's an orphan girl. She's lost her father and mother. And she was embraced and she was raised by her cousin, much older cousin, Mordecai. And we find out that they have a very tender relationship. Now, we're going to come back to Mordecai a little bit later on. We're told that Esther had a lovely figure and she was beautiful. Okay, this girl can turn heads. And she makes it through all the prelims in this deal, and she's one of the finalists that's selected to go before the king. Now, let me set this up a little bit, because this is like a big deal. I mean, the preparation to go in before the king. This is not just sort of a casual thing. This is, I mean, you can imagine, this is the date of a lifetime. And so I just have a few questions about dating for some of the ladies here. Honesty time, okay? Think about the amount of time that you spend preparing for a date. Like bathing, hair, makeup, wardrobe selection, accessories, perfume. And just be honest for a second. How many of you have ever spent more than an hour getting ready for a date? Really? How many of you have ever spent more time getting ready for the date than you actually spent on the date? All right. How many of you actually had more fun getting ready than you did on the actual date? Okay, here's the prep time for Esther. She's heading out on this date. Check this out. Esther 2:12. Before a young woman's turn came to go in to King Xerxes, she had to complete 12 months of beauty treatments prescribed for the women. 6 months with oil of myrrh, and 6 with perfumes and cosmetics. Now, that is a lot of pressure, don't you think? I mean, if somebody's not into you after 12 months of beauty treatments, it probably ain't going to happen. But it turns out that Esther is jaw-dropping. I mean, she is eye-poppingly beautiful. And she is chosen by Xerxes as the new queen. And her apparent mission was to be eye candy for the most powerful, wealthiest man on earth. So the king throws another party. And Esther lives happily ever after, right? Not so much. Turns out there's another character that enters this story, and his name is Haman. And he is Xerxes' chief of staff, his right-hand man. And he is a lot stronger leader than Xerxes. But Haman also has a shadow mission. Haman has this insatiable appetite for being praised and glorified. In fact, there's something that keeps him up at night. All the king's nobles will bow down and worship Haman, except one. And it just so happens to be Esther's cousin, Mordecai. We're told that Mordecai's job was to sit at the city gate, which meant that he was one of the city's royal officials. In fact, at one point, he had discovered a plot to assassinate King Xerxes, and he exposed it, and he saved the king's life. So he's kind of a big deal. But he won't bow down to Haman. Mordecai refuses. And so check this out. We're told, Esther 3, verses 5 and 6, when Haman saw that Mordecai would not kneel down or pay him honor, he was enraged. Yet having learned who Mordecai's people were, he scorned the idea of killing only Mordecai. Instead, Haman looked for a way to destroy all Mordecai's people, the Jews, throughout the whole kingdom of Xerxes. So he goes to Xerxes, and he asks the king to issue a royal decree to not only kill Mordecai, but all of Mordecai's people, all the Jews. Now, the king doesn't really care about justice, and he doesn't even know what people Haman is talking about. He doesn't care what people Haman is talking about. So he just goes ahead and he issues the decree. Now, Mordecai hears about this. And can you imagine? It says, when Mordecai learned of all that had been done, he tore his clothes, put on sackcloth and ashes, and went out into the city, wailing loudly and bitterly. And we look at that and we say, well, that's a pretty extreme response of grief. But it's actually a lot more than that. This was a political act. This is an act of protest. This is like picketing the White House. It's an act of extraordinary courage. And we discover that Mordecai is actually a remarkable man. But it becomes obvious to him that if anything productive is going to be done to fix this situation, if the people are to be saved, it's going to be up to Esther. So he sends word to Esther. You have to go to the king and get him to change his mind. Now, Esther is terrified to do this, and for very good reason. So she sends word back to Mordecai. This is chapter 4, verse 11. It says, all the king's officials, this is her word back to him, all the king's officials and the people of the royal provinces know that for any man or woman who approaches the king in the inner court without being summoned by the king has but one law, that they be put to death unless the king extends the gold scepter to them and spares their lives. But 30 days have passed since I was called to go to the king. So Esther's saying, look, Mordecai, you don't just barge into the royal chambers and talk to the king. You have to be invited. You have to be summoned. You only talk to the king at his request. Anything else is a death wish. Unless he happens to extend the golden scepter, if you barge in, it's death. You die. She's saying, even as queen, I have to be summoned. And Mordecai, you need to know, he hasn't called on me for more than 30 days. Okay, I'm not naive. I know that he has a very full harem of very beautiful young women, and he's not a one-woman kind of guy. And apparently, he's just not as into me as he used to be. So you want me to barge into the king's chambers and tell him that he's made a mistake? Like that he doesn't know how to rule his kingdom? That's suicide. Now, upon getting a response like that back, a lot of people would just sort of back off. They'd say, well, yeah, I get it. I understand. Never mind. Just can't be done. But not Mordecai. He's going to challenge her. He says to her, look, your royal position is no accident. He says, who knows but that you have come to your royal position for such a time as this? He's saying, Esther, the fate of a whole nation is in your hands. You didn't ask for this responsibility, but here it is. Esther, you have not been brought to this point in your life for the sake of accumulating an exquisite wardrobe and precious gems and exotic fragrances. Esther, you've not been brought to this point in your life just to become the most desirable and attractive woman in the kingdom. In fact, you've not been brought to this point of your life for any of the reasons that the king thinks you have. You've been brought to this point in your life to be a part of what it is that God is doing on this earth, to work for justice, to spare people a great suffering. Esther, you have a mission, and your mission matters. Esther, you've been brought to this point not for yourself, but to be a part of God's plan to redeem the world. So don't let your success at filling society's stereotype for women blind you to what God really says your life is all about. Don't be diverted by a shadow mission. And Mordecai helps her discern God's calling in her life. And he issues a very strong challenge. Esther, if you say no here, if you miss this, as frightening as this is, you'll miss the entire reason you're on this planet. Who knows but that you have come to your position for such a time as this? Esther, this is your moment. This is it. So Esther says, you're right. Oh, man, you're right. But I need strength that is beyond me to do this. I need God's help. And so she sends word back to Mordecai. And just check out her faith and courage. She says, go gather together all the Jews who are in Susa and fast for me. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my attendants will fast as you do. When this is done, I will go to the king, even though it is against the law. And if I perish, I perish. It's just unbelievable. It's this incredible moment. Then this courageous statement of faith and purpose and courage. She says, I will not allow my life to deteriorate just into a pursuit of my own comfort and elegance. There's just too much at stake. So as hard and as terrifying as this is my calling. And so I will risk my life. I will go to the king, and if I die, I die. I want to pause right here and ask a few questions. Just kind of some personal stuff for you and me. The first one is this. What's your shadow mission? Because everybody has one. But if your life just sort of drifts into default mode, what does it drift toward? Maybe it's about projecting a certain kind of image. Maybe it's about more power or more status at work. Maybe it's all about impression management. Or maybe for you, if you're honest, you have to say, you know what, it's all about comfort. It's about a nicer car. It's about a bigger house. It's about nicer vacations. For some of you, maybe your shadow mission is to win, finally, your fantasy football league. And for you, managing the stats and figuring out who to trade and following the whole thing, man, it consumes your life. Yeah, or do we have a thought for something else? Or maybe it's an obsession for you with some online video game, or maybe it's some other unhealthy online pursuit. But if you take your eyes off of Jesus and you just let your life drift, and you start to lose sight of the stuff that really matters, you start to lose your sense of God's calling on your life, what do you replace it with? What does it drift towards? Can you name it? Second question. Who do you have in your life that will play the role of Mordecai for you? Who do you have in your life that really knows you and really loves you? Someone with enough spiritual depth to help you discern God's calling in your life. Someone with enough courage to challenge you. To not let you just settle for less than God's best for you. I mean, who in your life cares about you enough to call out the best in you? And if you can identify someone like that, are you allowing them to speak into your life? Are you giving them that kind of voice? Because what happens is, so often, we actually want to run from those people. We don't want to hear that. But once we find somebody like that, we've got to start running to them. They are so valuable. Those people are like gold. Who plays that kind of a role in your life? Do you have anybody? And if so, what are you doing to cultivate that relationship? To get as much out of it as you possibly can. And if you can't think of anyone like that, I mean, if in your world there isn't a single person like that, it might be time for you to start thinking about reaching out. Because if you don't have anyone that you see as spiritually wise, if you don't have anyone that will challenge you, call you out, it might be time for you to develop some new relationships. Third question. Who are you Mordecai to? Who are you willing to be that for? And maybe you have a friend or someone in your world and you are watching them waste away their lives. You're watching them pursue destructive stuff, or maybe it's just trivial stuff. But you know that God wants more for them and you love them. Are you willing to say something? Are you willing to push them? Because if you won't, who will? And maybe you think, well, okay, but what if they don't listen? My challenge for you is, what if they do? Esther gets challenged by Mordecai, and it changed everything. Okay, so she fasts and she prays for 3 days. Now you can you just imagine the turmoil going on inside of her in the midst of all of this? And she goes and she stands in the king's inner court and she waits. And you can imagine her heart is in her throat, like life or death hangs in the balance. And the king comes in and he sees her and he reaches out his golden scepter. She's going to live, at least for the moment. In chapter 5, verse 3, it says, "Then the king asked, 'What is it, Queen Esther? What is your request? Even up to half the kingdom, it will be given to you.'" He's in a good mood. So far, this thing is going really well. Like all the praying and all the fasting seems to be paying off. And it kind of looks like she can have anything she wants at this point. Okay, but I think it's important for us, just a little aside, we have to kind of understand that culture a little bit. This statement, you can have anything you want, even up to half the kingdom. That's like king talk for, what is it you want? I'm in a good mood today. So if Esther actually said, okay, awesome, I'll take half the kingdom. His tone would change in a hurry. Okay, so this is more what he's saying is more along the lines of, Esther, would you like to be in charge of the remote tonight? Okay, so she can't just you read this and you go, well, then she just ask for it. No, Like, she can't just really say, okay, like, I'd like to have you revoke the unalterable law of the Medes and the Persians and put down your chief of staff. So she says, I'm throwing a party. And I want you to come. And bring Haman, too. She has street smarts. And she knows this king. And she knows that he has never turned down a party in his life. So the king and Haman go to her banquet, and they have a great time. And again, the king, he's like, okay. You know, what is it you want? Chapter 5, verses 6 to 8. As they were drinking wine, the king again asked Esther, now what is your petition? It will be given you. And what is your request? Even up to half the kingdom, it will be granted. Esther replied, my petition and my request is this. If the king regards me with favor, and if it pleases the king to grant my petition and fulfill my request, let the king and Haman come tomorrow to the banquet I will prepare for them. Then I will answer his question. She's showing so much patience and so much skill. And she is crafting this scenario. I mean, by coming to this second banquet now, he's acknowledging his favor of Esther. I mean, basically, the king has virtually almost already granted whatever the request is that she's going to make. Her intelligence and her timing in this they're brilliant. And now we're ready for the climax of the story. But the author gives us a little aside. He's going to kind of leave us in suspense for a minute. So he switches back to focus on Haman for a while. So let's look at this. Chapter 5, verses 9 to 13. Haman went out that day happy and in high spirits. What a party. But when he saw Mordecai at the king's gate and observed that he neither rose nor showed fear in his presence, he was filled with rage against Mordecai. Nevertheless, Haman restrained himself and went home. Calling together his friends and Zeresh his wife, Haman boasted to them about his vast wealth, his many sons, and all the ways the king had honored him, and how he had elevated him above the other nobles and officials. And that's not all, Haman added. I'm the only person Queen Esther invited to accompany the king to the banquet she gave. And she has invited me along with the king tomorrow. But all this gives me no satisfaction as long as I see that Jew Mordecai sitting at the king's gate. Now, Haman had a shadow mission that so many people in our culture have. It's called more. More wealth, more power, more success, more applause, just more. And the problem with a shadow mission is that it's never enough. It's always hollow in the end. There's no satisfaction. In fact, one of the signs that you're living for a shadow mission is this chronic sense of emptiness, because shadows never satisfy. Now, do Haman's wife and friends challenge him? Do they listen to this and go, what is wrong with you, man? And do they step out and challenge him a little bit? No. I mean, do they say, Haman, your trouble stems from being an egomaniac. If you were to shift your focus from how the kingdom can serve you to how you could serve the kingdom, you might find joy and goodness and fulfillment like beyond your wildest dreams. You need to forget about winning applause and worship and just learn how to serve. I mean, did they tell him that? No. They just play to his ego. Listen to verse 14. His wife Zeresh and all his friends said to him, have a pole set up reaching to a height of 50 cubits and ask the king in the morning to have Mordecai impaled on it. Then go with the king to the banquet and enjoy yourself. This suggestion delighted Haman, and he had the pole set up. So Haman has this gallows that's built. It's 75 feet high. Now, why so high? Well, he doesn't just want Mordecai executed. He wants him humiliated publicly. He wants to make a statement. So the story shifts back to the king. That night, King Xerxes can't sleep. And so the king asks his servants to come in and to read to him from a book called The Chronicles of the King. Guess who the book is about? His servants say, well, what shall we read to you? He's like, let's read that book about me. I mean, like his preoccupation with himself is just limitless. And so as they're reading to the king, and I don't know if they just kind of went like this and landed somewhere, as they're reading to the king, they read about this guy named Mordecai. This is all recorded in the annals of the king. They read about how one time this guy Mordecai exposed a plot to assassinate the king. And suddenly, as they're reading this, it occurs to Xerxes, you know what? Mordecai was never properly honored. He was never properly thanked. We should do something for him. Next thing that happens is Haman shows up. Now, he doesn't know what the king's been reading. And here's what happens. This is awesome. Chapter 6. When Haman entered, the king asked him, what should be done for the man the king delights to honor? Now Haman thought to himself, who is there that the king would rather honor than me? So he answered the king, for the man the king delights to honor, have them bring a royal robe the king has worn, and a horse the king has ridden, one with a royal crest placed on its head. Even the horse is going to wear a crown. Then let the robe and horse be entrusted to one of the king's most noble princes. Let them ride the man the king delights to honor and lead him on the horse through the city streets, proclaiming before him, this is what is done for the man the king delights to honor. And the king says, that's a great idea. And so now imagine this moment. He's like, that's a great idea, Haman. The man that I delight to honor is Mordecai. You pull the horse. And from here on, it is all downhill for Haman. So after he parades Mordecai through the streets, Esther finally holds the banquet the next night, and now the time is right. So he tells the king the story. She tells the king the story about her desperate situation, about this horrible plot to destroy all of her people. And she reminds the king that this edict still stands. And the king says, who would do this to you and to your people? And she looks in the corner and she's like, the evil Haman. And Haman ends up being hanged on the gallows that he had built for Mordecai. Mordecai then gets appointed as the new chief of staff. The king reverses his edict to kill all the Jews and instead makes an edict that the Jews are to be highly honored. And we are told that people all over the land started committing themselves to the God of Israel. And all of this is because one man was willing to name reality to a young woman. Perhaps you have come to your position for such a time as this. And one woman said no to her shadow mission of safety and security and wealth and status, and yes to following God, like even at the risk of her own life. And now it's our day. And you are where you are. And you've been given what you've been given for a reason. And the bad news is, on our own strength, we will always give in to our shadow mission. The good news is, Jesus understands. You think about this. We serve one who knows what it is to be tempted. Jesus actually faced his own shadow mission. For Jesus, his shadow mission was to be the Messiah, to be the king, to wear the crown without suffering, without the cross. Great New Testament scholar named F.F. Bruce wrote this. said time and time again that temptation came to Jesus from many directions to choose some less costly way of fulfilling that calling than the way of suffering and death. But he resisted it to the end. I mean, at the very beginning, and most of you know this story, at the very beginning, he's out in the desert, and Satan comes to him. And he says, you can be the Messiah without hunger. Just like turn these stones into bread. You can be the Messiah without pain. Just throw yourself down, and the angels will lift you up. You can be the Messiah without opposition. Just bow before me, and I'll give you all the kingdoms of this earth. Be the king with no suffering, with no cost. Later on, when Jesus tells the disciples that he's going to have to suffer, he's going to have to die. Many of you know the story. Peter pulls him aside and he says, Jesus, don't talk like that. That doesn't have to happen. You don't have to suffer. You don't have to die. And Jesus rebukes him sharply. Get behind me, Satan. That's the shadow mission. Jesus knew very well the origin of that idea. You think about his words as he's agonizing in prayer in the garden, the night before the crucifixion. Father, let this cup of suffering pass from me. But he concedes. Father, not my will, but thine be done. Your mission. God, your mission, not the shadow mission. The one that we follow knows the struggle, and he walks along beside us with grace and with strength. And the truth is that our lives are all a part of a much bigger story. And we don't get to see how God is working behind the scenes. And this is what's going on in the story of Esther. All that God is behind the scenes. Did you know that Esther is the only book in the Bible that never mentions the word God? Do you know that? And it's for a reason. It's because, as often is the case in our lives, God is sort of hiding just off stage. Like the play is going on, and God is just off stage behind the scenes. You can't see him, but ultimately, he's behind the whole story. You think about it. How is it that of all the women of the empire, a Jewish girl named Esther is the one that becomes queen? How is it that of all the men in the royal guard, it's Mordecai that saves the king from assassination? How is it that the king should have insomnia on the very night that Haman built a gallows for Mordecai? How is it that of all the stories in the annals, the one that is read to him that night was the one of Mordecai saving him from assassination? How is it that Haman, the scheming murderer, becomes the victim of his own schemes? How is it that Mordecai becomes his replacement? How is it that instead of being killed in a massive genocide, the people of Israel turn out to be a great light to other people that are far from God? The writer wants us to understand that in unseen, unknown, unnamed ways, on crosses, in palaces, in carpools, cubicles, construction sites, in schools, God is present. God is at work, often behind the scenes. You are where you are for a reason. You've been given what you've been given for a reason. Perhaps you've come to your position for such a time as this. So what is God calling you to do? What's he calling you to be where you are? Whatever that is, don't trade it. Don't trade it for anything else.